there were tweets that were like, "I know what you look like. I will be waiting for you in the street. You won't see me coming." And it wasn't, you know, one tweet or 10 tweets or 15 tweets. There were hundreds of these. And, I would, report them, and then that was time consuming, and I would block them, and that was time consuming. Now, by the way, there must have been a way for Twitter to say, gee, if there's a picture of a long-nosed guy, rubbing his hands together and saying something about Auschwitz, maybe that shouldn't be okay. But I grew up in a world in which perhaps 20 times before 2016 or 50 times before 2016 I'd ever encountered any form of anti-Semitism. And I would say it is not an exaggeration that since 2016, I've encountered this thousands of times. And it clearly has to do not just with social media, but with the fact that the president of the United States, as well as other leaders, including Vladimir Putin, the Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Brexit crowd in the UK, the UKIP crowd, have been actively promoting this, and to have the president essentially embrace ideas like Mexicans are rapists, or Muslims are bad and we should keep them out of the country, or, picking on African Americans on a regular basis, or using code words about Jews like globalists, empowers these people in a way that they have not been empowered in any country since the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe in the 1930s. And it's clearly going to get worse, because as the president finds himself more and more in a corner, he's going to do everything he can to inflame his supporters. And this small group of really extreme supporters that were fed by Bannon and Breitbart and Fox and Stephen Miller and John Kelly with his shepherding through of the immigration policies early in this administration, and via Charlottesville and via the attack on people, kneeling during the national anthem, and the attack on African American women legislators, and all sorts of things. That this is, in some ways the most pernicious and yet in a most dangerous component of this era in the United States and across Europe. And I don't want to dwell on my own experience, but I thought it would be useful to get your different takes on it. And let me start with you, Ed, because we've seen this in Europe with UKIP. We see nationalism in India with the Hindu Nationalist Party there. You've written about the decline of liberalism, meaning something other than liberal views, but do you see this as a trend, this kind of institutionalized hatred?
Unfortunately, I do. I mean, your very reasonable tweet, the one that prompted such a sort of vile outpouring of anti-Semitism, I think touches on what's happening. America is first in the queue to become a minority-majority country. There are countries in Europe that might follow sort of 50 or 100 years later, like Britain, but America is very much ahead in early 2040s, and it's never happened before. And I think that is creating status anxiety amongst whites who are doing less well, that is being exploited in diabolical ways by the likes of Donald Trump, Steve Bannon on this side of the Atlantic, and all the characters you mentioned on the other side. I should add that it's not just UKIP. very disturbing revelation that Jeremy Corbyn, was a member of this secret Facebook group, which told its members impenetrable to outsiders, that went beyond the usual anti-Zionist rhetoric that the left have in Britain and Europe, to very clearly biological racism against Jews. This is the leader of the Labour Party, and this is potentially Britain's next prime minister. And so, there's that sort of added dimension in British politics, which I find very disturbing. I'm not Jewish, but I've got a lot of Jewish friends in Britain who I've asked over the years about whether they perceive prejudice to be on the rise, and most have been pretty reassuring about the lack of the receding of anti-Semitism in Britain, but I don't think they are anymore. There is something new. The guardrails we talk about in terms of sort of the legal protection of democracy, are looking wobblier than they were a couple of years ago. But equally important, probably a lot more important, are the cultural guardrails that we took really as axiomatic in post-war Europe and the United States, are much less firm than we thought they were. That things that we thought could never happen again are now not inconceivable. And, the kinds of abuse to which you've been subjected, for which many, many sympathies, you handled it with great grace, I thought, are unfortunately metastasizing. And, I don't know other than what the solution is, other than to say people take their cue from their leaders. Trump is giving a green light to this kind of behavior. And if you think of it on the sort of on the opposite side of the coin, when you have leaders sending good signals, you think of Nelson Mandela and what could have happened in South Africa if there'd been a vindictive post-apartheid leader. You think of Mikhail Gorbachev and what could have happened in the late 80s in the Soviet Union if there'd been, a Stalinist in that role as opposed to him. Well, now we have got people who are stoking, pouring paraffin onto these prejudices, and the cultural guardrails are not as strong as we thought. So all I can do is say we are in DEFCON 3 mode. I think we need to be ultra vigilant in how we respond to this.
Well, I think the question of how do we respond to it is a really important one here. Before we get into the sort of specifics of that and how others have responded to it, I'd like to hear sort of Corey and Rosa's take. So, Corey, what about you?
Yeah, so I can't add anything substantive to what has already been said, but what I do want to add to what's been said is what I think all of us need to do, which is to say, yes, it is true. We are degrading the norms and the institutions that have made our country safe, that have made it the place where people in danger go and then feel incredibly grateful for the protection of the rule of law and of social tolerance and of setting guardrails for behavior that we expect of our public officials. And that has been the greatest achievement of our country, and it is what has enabled so many other achievements of our country. And all of us have a responsibility to stand up, to be counted, to hold hands with our friends and our neighbors and our co-religionists and our non-co-religionists and our fellow Americans and other people around the world who believe as we do. Where we are headed is a dangerous place, and all of us are going to be responsible for where we end up.
Rosa?
Yeah, no, the only thing I would add to that is just to really emphasize something that Corey said, which is that we have this fantasy, I think particularly we Americans and probably the British as well, we're these countries where we we believe that we invented the rule of law and that we have these institutional and legal guardrails that will protect us and keep us on the right track. And those laws and institutions don't exist independently of our culture and our cultural commitments to them. That this, I always, there's that famous quote by everybody's favorite long dead jurist, Learned Hand, to the effect of, when justice lives in the hearts of men and women, you don't need any constitution or laws. And when justice dies in the hearts of men and women, no laws and no constitution can save it.
Right.
And I think that's very powerfully right. And what we're seeing right now in the United States, for instance, is a struggle over not about whether institutions and laws will prevail over lawlessness, but over whether a culture of commitment to standing up for those institutions and laws, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's a little scary, will prevail. And I'm not sure who does prevail in this struggle. The jury is still out, to stick with my legal metaphors. But there. And this is very much really just reinforcing what Corey just said. It's up to us if we sit back and think, oh, well, the Constitution will stop this, or the courts will stop this, or this institution will stop this. Then we're doomed, because institutions don't exist independent of people, and laws don't get enforced independent of people who, constantly struggle to have them enforced and to make sure that they have real meaning and so forth. So it's a very frightening time. I do think we live at a moment when it feels like a lot of the certainties of certainly the post-World War II era in the United States, when I think, up until recently, you'd say it's not a story of uninterrupted progress on social and political norms, but it's been a largely positive story of greater inclusion and greater commitment to fairness and equality. And we clearly are at a moment where all of that is in jeopardy.
Well, I think that's the core issue here. There was an article in the Atlantic by the folks from Lawfare that touched upon a theme that we once touched upon on an episode about whether the United States was facing a constitutional crisis.
Right.
And the conclusions of the authors was that we were not in a constitutional crisis yet, but that what we were seeing was something like constitutional rot.
Yes.
And I know that resonates because you made the argument we're not in a constitutional crisis. I personally have a slightly different view, which is this is semantics. It's bad enough that let's set aside what we're going to call it and let's do something about it. But this idea of rot touches upon your notion of norms.
Well, rot can get you to the same place in the end as crisis. Obviously, crisis I think of as crisis as fast-breaking rot.
Right, but I think this idea that leaders have to act within norms and follow the law in order for institutions to work, and that when leaders both break the law and then other leaders don't act within the norms, it can snowball. And what we're seeing here is that, Trump or a few people around Trump embrace racist ideas. And for a whole host of other reasons, Gary Cohn doesn't quit. The people around Trump who are decent people, so-called decent people, they don't quit. The Republican Party doesn't speak out against it in any kind of meaningful way. He does more of it. Does the same thing with breaking the law. It gets worse and it gets worse. And we have this snowball effect where laws are broken, power is abused, but also discourse in society is altered because the leaders within the society are essentially giving license to the worst of us to drive the conversation. And, that to me is way more dangerous than, quote, collusion, because it's the corruption of the American idea and the idea of Western democracy. Ed, am I overstating this?
No, you're not. I mean, one of the sort of disturbing parallels, I'd hate to, equate Steve Bannon to Alexis de Tocqueville, but when Steve Bannon says politics flows from culture, I believe that he has a point, and it's a point that stems back to de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville wrote about the strength of America lying in the customs of its people, in their temper, in the attitude of everyday Americans. And I think that's absolutely right. Or to use a Marxian analogy, that really politics is superstructure, culture is base, the base. And so I don't think it's overwrought or overstating things to say that what we consider to be normal, polite behavior, getting devalued, and that bar being constantly lowered, is a profoundly troubling signal for the conduct of politics and the future of the values that we hold dear. I don't think you are overstating things.
Well, picking up on that, Corey, he's talking about the idea of culture being sort of foundational and politics being superstructure on that. The lament or the fear of the alt-right, of the white supremacist movement, of the nationalist movement in many places in Europe is that there is a cultural wave that's changing the nature of their societies, and that's what's to be feared. But actually, by having leaders in